Thank you,
Recording
Ian.
in progress.
Now for the message of the day. I was never a fan of history, unlike John and I were discussing before. To me, history just seemed like memorization of battles and leaders and dates. More recently, I've turned my attention to history, particularly the history of people, places, and events that occurred during my lifetime. While the media may have reported on those people and events, at the time, I paid little attention to the details as they were happening. Besides, I had no access to television. We didn't get one until 1989. And NPR and PBS were not there in my childhood and years of growing up. Today's message is titled, Martin Luther King Jr. was a man, not a saint. First off, we are in a Unitarian Universalist sanctuary, which doesn't really talk about saints very often. Nevertheless, we're going to explore this topic. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is sometimes referred to as a saint. He had a short but eventful life. Born in 1929, he became an early leader of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Many streets and schools have been named after him. He was a national monument on the Capitol Mall dedicated specifically to him and the movement. Statues were placed in many cities. In fact, we have one such statue in downtown South Bend. Martin was known for his oratory and his special talent in motivating others with his words. He was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, and a national holiday was declared for his memory that occurred earlier this week. Since my retirement from practicing medicine, I have read a few books about America's civil rights movement, most notably the recent biography named King, which you can see up there. I also read the Kerner Report, which investigated the causes of the violence and riots of the 1960s. And 2 days ago, I took this book out of the library called New Prize for These Eyes, written by the author of Eyes on the Prize, that famous series on PBS. This by Juan Williams, and it's very interesting about the second civil rights movement, which hopefully we're entering today. I've also taken some tours of the South focusing on the civil rights movement. The first one was led by the UU minister of the Elkhart Church, Gordon Gibson. And the second was sponsored by the Black Student Union at IUSB, led by Monica Tetzlaff and Daryl Heller. Before going further, I'd like to review some definitions and add a word about nomenclature. For convenience today, I may refer to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as Martin or MLK. Also, I will use the vernacular as it reflects the language of the times. Words such as colored, Negro, Black, Afro-American may be used interchangeably, though mostly in our discussions today, we'll talk about civil rights, addressing issues faced by all people of color and all people of gender. According to Wikipedia, the definition of civil rights is that class of rights that protect an individual's freedom from infringement upon by governments, social organizations, and private individuals. They ensure one's entitlement to full participation in the civil and political life of the state. Wikipedia lists 5 major civil rights. They are freedom from discrimination, freedom to worship as one chooses, right to vote for our elected representatives, protections of due process, and finally, the right to privacy. Now, a saint is defined as a person who has died and is venerated for goodness and holiness. Why might Martin Luther King be called a saint? Well, he started life out in, as I said, 1929, named Michael King. At 5 years old, his father went to Germany and developed a close connection with the German friar who nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. That act split Western Christianity and started the Protestant Reformation. The father, upon returning to the U.S., he was also named Michael, but Michael Sr., changed both of their names to Martin Luther to honor that friar. This foreshadowed his commitment to equality and respect for everyone, as well as the challenges that he would experience during the American Civil Rights Movement. Martin was an extremely accomplished orator. As I said before, he encouraged his listeners to speak up, protest any discrimination and racial inequalities. He often put himself in the midst of that action and often suffered the consequences. In fact, in 11 years from 1956 to 67, he was jailed 30 times. He was a personable man who formed associations with many types of people, including presidents, leaders of other faith traditions, entertainers like Harry Belafonte and Mahalia Jackson, as well as with working men and women, such as the trash collectors in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin was known for his calmness in times of personal attack. At Crozier Theological Seminary, a white student once pointed a gun at him, accusing Martin of messing up his room. Martin was incredibly calm during this action, and that impressed all of the other people who saw it. He often made references to his early death, which he said would be in the service to others. Many years before his assassination, his family's home was bombed. He survived the death threats, and he actually had a knife put into his body by a woman at a public event. That knife wound was so close to a vital organ that it was said if he even sneezed, he would have died immediately. He survived. When called by others to attend, speak to them, or demonstrate with them who were experiencing discrimination or injustice, MLK was often revered as a prophet, or he was referred to as Alabama's Moses. Now to discuss the man. As a youth, Martin often felt torn between the love of his mother and the encouragement she gave him, saying that he was smart. He was as good as anyone else. Yet the evidence put forth by the society he lived in was much different. It said, you are less than, you are not equal to. Early on, Martin began preaching, not only in his father's Ebenezer Baptist Church, but also in many neighboring churches. He was noted to be a talented preacher and was even ordained in the Baptist church before he went to seminary. He skipped grades in school, and attended Morehouse College with the thought of avoiding church life, the life that he had grown up in. Instead, he contemplated an academic life. Nevertheless, after Morehouse, he chose to go to the Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. This choice was in part because he wanted to experience living in the North, but also because one of his Morehouse professors had helped him see that Black pastors could be emotional, intellectual, and political all at the same time. Martin had grown up in a segregated society of the South. As referenced in the Story for All Ages, there were strict Jim Crow laws that upheld segregation of the races in the hospitals, in the schools, at the drinking fountains, and in recreational facilities. He recalled seeing his father, the well-known pastor of the churches, of one of the biggest Baptist churches in Atlanta, being referred to as boy by a policeman. When Martin entered Crozier at age 19, he was suddenly put into an environment with white students, something he had never experienced before. Some of these students were older, were veterans, and some were married with children. At 19, this was quite a difference for him. He witnessed white women cleaning his room, cooking and serving his meals. He was put into an environment where he was in contact with many more white people than he had ever experienced in Georgia. He studied hard, was at the top of his class, yet he often engaged in what today we call plagiarism. He borrowed heavily from the words of his professors and the sermons of others. After graduating from Crozier, Martin wanted to explore an academic career, and he entered the doctoral program at Boston University, one of my alma maters. He met Coretta, who was a Southerner from Alabama, and she would become his wife. As he and Coretta were making plans for their future together, they had many questions. Should they settle in the South or the North? Would they be an academic family or a church family? As you know, they landed in the South at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. During the first year there, Martin began a long-term association with two important, influential individuals who would share his passions for equality and action. They were Ralph Abernathy and Bayard Rustin. Now, Bayard Rustin introduced him to Gandhi and the nonviolent tactics being used for civil disobedience. Rustin was also responsible for introducing Martin to a man named Stanley Levison, a Jewish lawyer and businessman from New York. Levison had been a top financier of the Communist Party USA. Because this was an era of McCarthyism, and because Martin was associated with Levison, he fell under the scrutiny of J. Edgar Hoover. His telephones were tapped, and he was followed by FBI agents from then on. Martin was a known philanderer. When in the North, he dated many women, including a white woman to whom he proposed. Even after becoming engaged to and marrying Coretta, he was dating others, and dating is used loosely here. His philandering would continue throughout his life, and it became an obsession of J. Edgar Hoover's. Hoover would use these informations gathered by the FBI in order to publicly discredit Martin. Now, 1954-55, the year that he landed at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, was a remarkable year, not only for Martin, but also for our country. Widespread fear dominated black communities of the South. Several sentinel events were occurring. Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision had been decided. Alabama officials were declaring that integration would never come in the state. And things like Emmett Till's death, where he was brutally beaten and shot in the head, attached to a gin fan and dumped in the river. Black laborers, such as the Pullman workers, were being organized under A. Philip Randolph, and NAACP chapters were cropping up all over the country. Martin was catapulted into prominence as tensions relating to discriminatory treatment of non-whites in Montgomery grew. And as we saw in the Story for All Ages, the bus became a major focus of attention. Just a word about that. Apparently, there are 36 rows of seats in a bus, and a first 10 rows were reserved for whites only. Black passengers would have to get on the bus, pay their fare, which sometimes didn't get any change, and sometimes the bus would take off before they could get out and walk around to the back to enter the rear door, where they would sit in the last 10 rows. The 16 middle rows were variable, so that if they were filled with white people and a black person was sitting there, the driver would ask them to move, or if it was full already in the back of the bus, they would have to stand for the rest of their journey. We all know about what happened with Rosa Parks. Afterwards, the leaders, she was not, by the way, the first person who was asked to change their seat, but the others were not arrested like she was. And people were getting pretty upset with the way that this was going, so they organized a group of leaders. Martin was one of the first people asked to join the group of leaders. At first he said, quote, I want some more time to think about this, but only under the urging of his friend Ralph Abernathy did he take the lead. And he then became the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which later merged into or evolved into the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Within a few hours of accepting the leadership of the Montgomery Improvement Association, a mass meeting was called, and Martin was asked to deliver a speech to the crowd, which he had only 20 minutes to prepare for. He did that speech, and it is regarded by him as the most decisive speech of his life. There were national coverage of the proposed action in Montgomery, and he knew he needed to encourage people to suffer for their freedom, be moderate enough to keep their fervor under control, and to help everyone believe that it would be a success. These ideas would guide the rest of his life, and he found his new voice that day. He sensed that the purpose was not to instruct or educate, but to prophesize. He was only 26 years old on the day he delivered that landmark speech, and it laid out the path for him and for the movement. It addressed the crippling fear that had long gripped the community. He described the events of the week before, which was Rosa Parks and her defiance. He praised her. In his words, he referred to the times as when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. Many of the leaders of the Montgomery Action Group would meet with and combine forces with the SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Martin would eventually produce many writings, give many speeches, march many miles, face many death threats against him and his family, have doubts, and eventually fall to the assassin's gunshot at age 39. His dedication, struggle to achieve equality and respect for all people continues today. He started with seeking to end discrimination on the buses. He partnered to get expansion of voting rights for all citizens. And then he turned his attention to ending the Vietnam War and reducing poverty. In the 60s, there were several riots with arrests and property destruction. Some thought that the unrest was stirred up by Martin Luther King and the likes of him. When President Johnson commissioned the Kerner Report to address the riots of the 60s, the conclusion could be just applied today. Quote, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white. I would change, or separate and unequal. Today I would modify that to say our world has two societies, the haves and the have-nots. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to joining you later this morning or any day to carry forth the discussion about this and other lay-led services of earlier months. We will now receive the offering. This building and our Unitarian Universalist presence depends on the contributions of your time, your talents, and of course, your money. If you are attending virtually, you may mail the contribution to 801 East Washington, South Bend, or use the QR code on the screen for your donation.